The year was 1970. The Chinese population has ballooned to numbers beyond its resource capacity, so in response, the government promoted the practice of later, longer, fewer. This meant later marriages, longer intervals between childbirth, and fewer children were enforced. However, this method of population control was insufficient, so consequently, the one-child policy was born. So this policy included rules that restricted urban couples to only one child, with exceptions for those ethnic minorities or with a severely disabled child. The big reasons for China's implementation of this dystopian-like policy was to prevent the population growth from outpacing economic development and to allow natural supplies to stay in balance. If not, the expanding population would hypothetically run out of resources. This famous policy was only meant to be temporary, yet persisted until 2015 and left a myriad of consequences rippling throughout China. The reasons for the one-child policy were logical, yet the unintended effects made the one-child policy decision that may never be forgotten in Chinese history. The forced abortions, propaganda, adoptions, aging population, and an unequal number of boys in the country made this policy one to be heavily scrutinized, even though it may have prevented a population boom. All these consequences will be carefully considered in this video presentation. First, the one-child policy was a plan good on paper, I have to admit, but in practice, it left many families, notably mothers, filled with trauma. The movie One Child Nation specifically unearthed the tragedies the policy left behind that included, but not limited to, forced abortions, forced sterilizations, houses destroyed if families didn't comply, babies abandoned in marketplaces, and even stolen children. The documentary included many stories told from these families, while also including the government workers who wreaked havoc on these families in the name of law and order. Even sadder, there were graphic photos of dozens of fetuses in landfills. Many families didn't feel like they had a choice and had abandoned their newborns in the hopes a stranger would pick them up and give them a better life. There was a terrible story on this documentary of a set of identical twins getting separated and one getting put up for adoption forcibly. Many women went kicking and screaming into clinics and had to be under anesthesia to be sterilized. The look on mothers' faces who count the age their children would be if they didn't have to abort them would give any person shivers. According to expert Elizabeth Davis, a professor at the Colorado School of Mines specializing in research on China, many mothers who lived through the policy have hard feelings towards the government because of the lack of control of their own bodies. Having children is a personal decision, and a law that restricts that is one that will forever be contested. To keep the public to comply with the policy, the Chinese government had a lot of propaganda in the hopes that citizens would have a better perception of the mandate. That means the personal stories, if not to be documented, may be lost to history. Instead, propaganda in the form of posters, murals, and performances would only be left. A common sentiment of "we had no choice" echoed throughout each of the government agents upholding the one-child policy at the expense of their peers. Propaganda contributed to this massive groupthink instilled fear in any divergent thoughts, allowing an evil eye figure to watch over every Chinese citizen. Whether the communist government reveled in this power over their citizens or not, these consequences left families torn apart and disturbed. Along with the pressure from the government, pressure from society left many households having to make tough decisions about their children. According to Professor Davis, if you were in a high-ranking government position, while you would have been capable of paying the fines for having another child, you wouldn't dare think about it because you'd be scrutinized by your peers. On the flip side, Davis notes, many rural families chose to keep their children. They paid the fines and raised them to work on the farms. They didn't feel the pressure from their neighbors about their choices. Propaganda and honor-shame culture played a big role for families in deciding whether or not to have another child. What happened to all the children that weren't aborted, didn't die after birth, or weren't kept by their Chinese family? They were put in orphanages and adopted internationally. A giant market that came out of the one-child policy was international adoption. and I am personally part of that story. I was adopted November 2001 and have no record of my birth parents and their hardships and what they had to endure for me to get here today. My story is not unique. From 1999 to 2016, a total of 78,257 children were adopted by American families. Most of them were girls and from middle-class families. Boys were valued in Chinese society because they were expected to take care of their parents when they were older, while girls would take care of their in-laws. Professor Davis notes that most of the girls adopted abroad were likely from middle-class families because their relatives didn't want to face public scrutiny. While it is unfortunate that many families were forcibly separated due to the government's one-child policy, I am personally grateful because I think I have more opportunities in the United States than I would have in China. Along with the personal and emotional hardships, Chinese demographics were hurt during the implementation of the one-child policy. Most notably, because earlier generations before the policy often had 5 children, there was a large aging population without support from the younger generation. By 2050, about 1/3 of the population will be made up of people over the age of 60, causing intense strain on the state services and the children who will bear the responsibility of caring for elderly relatives. This demographic shift was the reason why the policy was terminated. Now, China is trying to engineer a baby boom. However, the fertility rate in 2016 stood at 1.62 children per woman, without a sign of a sharp increase. China should have stopped the policy 28 years ago. Now it's too late, says Yi Fushan, a senior scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a longtime critic of family planning policies. What is interesting is that Professor Davis states that China would have gotten to this state eventually without the draconian laws, since richer and more developed countries have lower birth rates. That could be explained by education and improving income levels, where having children have been delayed. Long ago, women would have children in their teens, but now they are in their late 20s or 30s when they're choosing to have children. Davis mentions that while it may have taken a generation more to reach the fertility rates it has now, the one-child policy isn't considered necessary. Finally, the cultural shift of the value of boys to girls is a result of the one-child policy. As discussed before, boys were valued because they were expected to take care of their family as they grew up. They were invested in and valued. However, because of the intense adoption of Chinese girls by international couples, boys are the majority by a landslide in China. Simon Dime from the Washington Post summarizes it best. Beyond an epidemic of loneliness, the imbalance distorts labor markets, drives up saving rates in China and drives down consumption, artificially inflates certain property values, and parallels increases in violent crime, trafficking, or prostitution in a growing number of locations. The far-reaching consequences of the one-child policy could be considered disastrous for China, a country with the second largest economy in the world. On the other hand, though, the Chinese singleton daughters, known as urban daughters, coming of age are being valued and empowered. Because these daughters don't have to compete with their brothers since they're an only child, they're enjoying unparalleled support from both parents. Singleton daughters have unprecedented power to deal with gender norms in ways that benefit them. However, that is only in areas with opportunities for education and employment for women, so rural areas are more difficult for women to thrive. Overall, the one-child policy left cultural shifts that have both negatively and positively impact each gender from birth. The one-child policy was a governmental act that would be hard-pressed to find in any other country. Its 35-year run to stop population growth worked, yet at a great cost. The emotional trauma of having to lose a child through abortion, adoption, or death cannot be forgotten. The magnitude of the elderly population in relation to the younger generation will leave impacts that will ripple for a long period of time. Finally, the consequences of having a majority male population will hurt China's economy and its people. I asked Professor Davis if the one-child policy was a necessary evil. Her response was a large sigh. Quote, "The Chinese government felt it was a necessary evil," but continued with a sentiment that counteracted that, mentioning that it was statistically inevitable that China's population would become under control. This has made me think about all the lives changed due to the strict population control by the Chinese government and what would have happened if it wasn't implemented. What can we learn from China's mistakes, and what can we do if there's ever a situation like this again?